What if the story we call the beginning is really only a surviving fragment? What if the chronicles we trust are merely the charred leaves left after a library was burned, and the true narrative, the one written when the world was young and humanity was not alone, lies buried under continents, sealed behind ruin, and whispered only in the dreams of civilizations that rose and fell long before our own dawn? The first empire is spoken of only in riddles, in symbols carved into stone, older than agriculture, older than writing, older than the ice that once covered half the planet. Yet the deeper archaeologists dig, the more it feels like something is wrong with the picture we have been given. Not because the evidence is missing, but because it is too old, too advanced, too deliberate. As if someone built foundations long before there should have been builders at all. Imagine a world we never inherited, a world that existed long before the familiar names of Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Indus Valley. A world that didn't simply vanish, but was possibly erased. A world whose fingerprints appear like shadows. A megalith under the sea, a geometric alignment carved into a desert that shouldn't have had architects yet. A star map older than the stars should have been charted. This story begins with those shadows, but it doesn't end there. Because when you trace those shadows back far enough, they all point to the same place, a forgotten beginning, a civilization so ancient that even myth strains to remember it, a civilization some call the First Empire. Before we step into the mysteries of this old world, if you enjoy these quiet explorations into hidden chapters of our past, feel free to gently like or subscribe, only if it feels right to you. And as this story reaches you now, I softly wonder where you are listening from, and what time it is in the place where this tale has found you. The visuals you see here are only a companion. They add texture, but you don't need them to follow the journey. So take a moment for yourself, get comfortable, dim the lights just a little, and settle in. The past is about to open. At the edge of Turkey's southeastern plains lies a hill that once seemed ordinary, just another mound in a landscape filled with them. But beneath it, stone was dreaming. In 1994, a shepherd's pick struck something smooth, curved, unnaturally shaped. What emerged over the next decades would defy every assumption about early humanity. Göbekli Tepe, an architectural enigma rising from prehistory, a sanctuary of towering T-shaped pillars arranged in concentric circles, carved with animals that never roamed together, symbols that have no known origin, and craftsmanship that should have been impossible 12,000 years ago. Even now, standing inside its central ring on a cool morning, the wind carries a stillness that feels older than the stones themselves. The light comes slow, crawling across the limestone in soft gold, catching the carved foxes, vultures, snakes, and the strange human figures with no faces. The air hums with quiet, like a memory pressing against the present. Every textbook once told us that large-scale architecture began with agriculture, cities, and organized states. But Göbekli Tepe is older than all of them. It suggests something else, something far more unsettling. People who, according to mainstream chronology, were supposed to be nomadic hunter-gatherers with no hierarchy, no surplus, and no time for monumental works, somehow managed to quarry, transport, and erect stones weighing tons, arrange them in astronomically aware patterns, and carve them with symbolic language that has no known predecessor. And then, mysteriously, They buried the entire complex under tons of soil, as if to hide it not just from the elements, but from the future. What kind of culture builds something so vast only to enter it deliberately? Some say Göbekli Tepe was a temple of early mythmakers. Others say it was a ritual center for seasonal gatherings. But the more one looks, the more it feels like something else. An outpost, a fragment, a surviving node of a civilization older than the surrounding world. A lighthouse left behind when a greater structure collapsed. Because Göbekli Tepe appears not as the start of something, but as the last chapter of something that had already existed for a very long time. As excavations expanded, more anomalies emerged. Beneath the topsoil lay even older layers, each more sophisticated than the last. Instead of finding rough, primitive beginnings as archaeology expected, researchers found refinement, geometry, consistency. A continuity of technique suggesting that the people who built the earliest layers were not experimenting with architecture. They were perfecting it. They were remembering something. This place did not feel like a birthplace. It felt like a survival. And Göbekli Tepe is only one doorway into the First Empire's shadow. Thousands of miles away, in a region far older than the pyramids, a submerged city rests quietly off the coast of India. At dawn, the Gulf of Kambat is gray-blue, calm and cold. The sea smells of salt and silt. Fishermen rise early, casting nets in waters that have fed their families for generations. But what sleeps beneath them is not fish, nor coral, nor the broken skeleton of a shipwreck. It is geometry, streets, walls, platforms, and what appears to be a grid-like arrangement far too deliberate to be natural. When sonar first revealed it in the early 2000s, the scientific world divided sharply. Some insisted it was nothing more than stone formations. Others argued that the linear structures, right angles, and spatial relationships pointed to something undeniably human-made. The sediments retrieved from the site were dated to nearly 9,000 years old, again older than the accepted rise of cities. The mainstream view quickly tried to contain the implications. Perhaps natural formations just happened to look artificial. Perhaps the dating of material was contaminated. Perhaps the sonar misinterpreted echoes. Anything to keep the timeline intact. Yet when traces of worked stone, tool-shaped fragments, and patterned debris emerged, the argument became more difficult to dismiss. The question was no longer whether human hands had shaped something there, but why such an early settlement, if it was a settlement, had been swallowed by the sea. That question only sharpened when researchers noted that the site would have been habitable during the last glacial period, when sea levels were lower and the coastline extended far into what is now open water. If true, this would place the structure's origins in an era when mainstream history insists that humans were still small, scattered bands, without the means or need to construct large coastal settlements. And yet the seabed tells a different story. The old world seems to whisper from the deep. There was more before you. Far more. Across the ocean, on the opposite side of the world, another riddle sleeps under the canopy of the Amazon. The rainforest is a master at concealing the past. Its thick vines and relentless growth devour stone, erase paths, swallow cities. For centuries, explorers heard rumors of geometric earthworks deep within the heart of the forest. Circular mounds, linear trenches, perfect squares the size of football fields, all invisible from the ground. When satellite mapping finally peeled back the greenery, the shapes emerged like ghosts, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, all aligned with cardinal directions, all constructed with a precision that implies planning, labor, and knowledge of mathematics that should not have existed among small tribes. And the soil itself told a stranger tale. Terra preta, a rich, engineered earth filled with charcoal, bone fragments, and microminerals that do not occur naturally in the region. This soil can regenerate itself, and portions of it appear thousands of years older than the civilizations we associate with early Amazonian culture. It suggests a people who cultivated land on a massive scale, who understood geochemistry, who reshaped entire landscapes in ways we barely comprehend. And then they vanished, leaving behind only geometry hidden in trees. If the Amazon once held a complex society capable of shaping hundreds of square miles, what event wiped them away so thoroughly that only faint scars remain? What cataclysm burned their story until only its outline remains? But these are not isolated anomalies. They form a pattern, subtle but insistent, a whisper beneath the official story. A megalith in Turkey, a drowned city in India, engineered soil in the Amazon. Together they form the outline of something that doesn't fit within the neat boundaries of the human timeline we were taught. Something older, wider, global. And then there is the stone that should not exist. The pyramids of Caral in Peru, older than the pyramids of Egypt. The serpent-shaped mounds in North America, whose alignments match solstices with an accuracy rivaling ancient observatories. The megalithic platforms of Baalbek in Lebanon, built with stones weighing hundreds of tons, too large to be moved even with modern cranes. The Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan, a submerged formation whose steps, terraces, and right angles ignite debate to this day. Mainstream explanations treat each anomaly separately. Caral is an early but isolated civilization. The Serpent Mound is a symbolic earthwork created much later. Baalbek's giant stones were moved with sledges and ramps. Yonaguni is natural erosion. Each answer is designed to keep the broader timeline intact, to ensure that nothing predates the accepted start of civilization around 6,000 years ago. But when taken together, the anomalies resist separation. They resist coincidence. They build a picture of a world that once knew how to shape stone on a continental scale, how to track stars with millimeter precision, how to survive climate shifts and global upheavals. A world that may have lived and died before the civilizations we call ancient ever emerged. The First Empire is not a kingdom or a dynasty. It is a concept, the anchor we will return to throughout this journey. A civilization so ancient that its memory dissolved into flood myths, sky maps, and symbols humans later inherited without understanding. A civilization that may not have left monuments in one place, but fragments across the entire earth, scattered like relics of a forgotten age. And perhaps the clearest fragment lies in the oldest alignment of all, the stars. The night sky has always been our oldest archive, long before stone was shaped, before symbols were carved, before the first myth was spoken aloud beside a fire. Human eyes lifted upward in wonder. But somewhere within that wonder lies a strange convergence. Patterns repeated across continents, constellations mapped before agriculture, star myths synchronized in ways that should have been impossible for cultures separated by oceans. If there was ever a signature left behind by a forgotten civilization, it would be written in the sky, because the sky is the only thing that survives every cataclysm. In the high desert of Peru, where winds sweep across ancient plains, the Nazca lines stretch like a silent manuscript carved into earth. Most are familiar with the animals: the hummingbird, the spider, the monkey. But far older, far fainter, are the straight lines that extend for kilometers, precise, unwavering, intersecting at angles that mimic celestial alignments. From the ground, they make little sense. From above, they form a map. Modern archaeologists propose ritual pathways or astronomical calendars, but something about the geometry feels unlike anything made for ceremony. The precision suggests measurement, surveying, indexing. It is as if the desert once served as a vast open-sky observatory, or perhaps a memory palace designed to preserve knowledge before something erased its keepers. Across the world in southern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe's pillars bear carvings of celestial objects, crescent moons, abstracted stars, and alignments that correspond eerily with constellations as they would have appeared tens of thousands of years ago. One pillar, known to researchers as the Vulture Stone, appears to encode the date of a catastrophic impact event around 10,900 BCE, matching the Younger Dryas boundary, a climatic shock that reshaped the planet. How could people who supposedly lacked writing preserve a date with such astronomical precision? Why use a massive megalith as the medium? And why bury it afterward, as if the knowledge itself was too dangerous? In Egypt, the alignment of the three pyramids at Giza echoes the belt stars of Orion. But here, too, the correlation only matches the sky as it looked not in 2500 BCE, the accepted construction date, but thousands of years earlier. Some propose coincidence, others intentional symbolism. But the idea that multiple cultures across enormous distances revered the same star pattern, encoded the same alignments, and treated Orion as an axis between worlds hints at something deeper. Perhaps these alignments were not mythic references, but coordinates, or warnings, or remnants of an older system of navigation tied to a time when the world's geography, climate, and sea levels were entirely different. And then there are the Aborigines of Australia, whose star lore is among the oldest on Earth. Their oral traditions describe constellations that no longer exist in the same form, suggesting observations predating known human habitation of the continent. Their stories of cosmic beings descending from the sky, building structures, teaching laws, and then vanishing, mirror myths found in Sumer, Mesoamerica, India, and Africa. Cultures separated by oceans share legends of sky visitors, not necessarily extraterrestrials, but beings from a higher epoch, survivors of a prior age, custodians of knowledge passed down through myth after their physical empires fell. This is where mainstream chronology grows uncomfortable. How can cultures with no contact share motifs, star maps, and cosmologies that align too neatly to be coincidence? Anthropologists explain the similarities as convergent myth-making, the human mind generating shared archetypes. But convergent myth-making does not explain similar astronomical precision, identical geometric ratios, or the inexplicable match between distant megalithic monuments and the same few constellations. To preserve the timeline, scholars insist that early humans simply had more observational time than we assume, or that myths traveled indirectly over millennia. But even that explanation begins to strain when we look at the oldest sky map of all, the Lascaux Cave. Inside the French cave system, painted more than 17,000 years ago, amidst the famous animals and symbolic shapes, lies a cluster of dots arranged in a pattern identical to the Pleiades star cluster. Another panel appears to depict Orion. The cave painters were Paleolithic nomads, yet their artwork encodes constellations with modern accuracy. The idea that they had such knowledge by coincidence stretches plausibility. It feels more like inheritance, the last flicker of a memory passed down from a people who came before them, a people who looked up at the same stars with deeper understanding. And then there is the enigma that may be the oldest memory of all: the world axis. Across mythologies, there is a recurring image: a pillar of heaven, a cosmic mountain, a world tree connecting earth and sky, a central axis holding reality together. In Norse tradition, it is Yggdrasil. In Hindu cosmology, it is Mount Meru. In Central Asia, it is the Golden Pillar. In the Americas, it is the Sky Tree. No matter the culture, the depiction is similar: a connection between realms, a structure linking heaven and earth. If the First Empire once unified vast territories, the axis may have been not a metaphor, but a literal monument or technology, perhaps a beacon, perhaps a calendar, perhaps something we can no longer comprehend. What survives of the First Empire is scattered, fragmented, encoded in stone and myth, but one discovery stands apart. A discovery that forces us to reconsider what the old world might have truly known. Off the western coast of Cuba, in waters nearly 2,000 feet deep, lies one of the most controversial structures ever detected. Sonar scans in the early 2000s revealed massive geometric formations, blocks arranged in rectangular patterns, long corridors, pyramidal shapes, and grid-like foundations stretching for hundreds of meters. The depth alone presents a problem. The site would have been dry land more than 12,000 years ago, before the end of the Ice Age. If these structures are artificial, they predate not just Egyptian or Sumerian civilization, but agriculture itself. When the images were released, mainstream reactions were swift and dismissive: misinterpreted sonar, natural formations, pareidolia. But the formation didn't go away. Divers who attempted to explore it reported worked stone and right angles too precise to be natural. The site remains largely unstudied, not because it is understood, but because it is too inconvenient. And yet, this is not the only submerged anomaly that challenges our chronology. Off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan lies a massive structure with terraces, staircases, and platforms that resemble an ancient city. In the Mediterranean, the ruins of Pavlopetri, nearly 6,000 years old, rest fully intact on the seabed. Off the coast of Malta, mysterious cart ruts disappear into the ocean, cut into stone with unknown tools. If so many structures ended up underwater, what global event drowned them? Most explanations point to rising seas after the last glacial maximum. But the rate of rise, the sudden flooding events, and the patterns of destruction align suspiciously with a catastrophic trigger: an impact, a meltwater pulse, a rapid destabilization. Some researchers connect these events to the Younger Dryas boundary, when temperatures plunged, megafauna vanished, and global cultures experienced abrupt change. Mainstream view: the climate shift was natural, perhaps caused by changes in ocean currents. Unaccepted view: something struck Earth or destabilized its climate violently, wiping out earlier civilizations whose ruins now lie beneath the waves. And in the middle of this debate lies a whisper older than even the ice, a whisper preserved in myths worldwide, the story of a great flood. In Sumer, the epic of Ziusudra predates the epic of Gilgamesh, describing a god who warns of a coming deluge. In Greece, Deucalion survives a flood sent by Zeus. In India, Manu is warned by a fish avatar to build a boat before the waters rise. In China, the Great Flood lasts generations. In the Americas, tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon recount a flood that reshaped the world. Aboriginal Australians tell of the sea swallowing their ancestral lands. These stories are not similar. They are identical in structure, theme, and sequence. Cultures isolated by oceans all remember the same catastrophe. One myth could be coincidence. Hundreds are not. The flood is not just a story. It is a memory of an event that erased cities, languages, sciences, and histories we will never recover. A memory of the moment when the first empire, if it existed, was destroyed. But what if the flood was not merely water? What if the true catastrophe was something else? Something that triggered the water, something that the surviving cultures struggled to describe in metaphor. This leads us to another enigma scattered across the globe: vitrified stone. In Scotland, hill forts exhibit stones melted together by heat exceeding thousands of degrees, heat impossible to achieve with wood fires. In the Middle East, ancient walls contain patches of fused rock. In parts of Peru and Turkey, stone surfaces appear heat-treated, as if exposed to immense energy. Mainstream explanation: lightning strikes, accidental fires, geothermal anomalies. But the vitrification patterns are too uniform, too controlled, too purposeful. Some researchers speculate ancient peoples developed techniques we have lost, methods to shape stone using heat. Others argue these sites bear the scars of a catastrophe, an event that unleashed energy far beyond natural processes. What kind of world was the first empire? One advanced enough to shape landscapes, align monuments with stars, survive climate shifts, and leave behind symbols that outlasted even its languages. But if it existed, what ended it? To answer that, we follow the trail into a deeper mystery, one encoded not in ruins or stars, but in DNA. The double helix remembers more than we think. Within strands of DNA lie echoes of migrations, bottlenecks, expansions, and mysterious divergences that defy the standard model of early human history. Mainstream geneticists acknowledge a severe population bottleneck around 70,000 years ago, often attributed to the Toba eruption. But this is only one disruption. Other anomalies persist. Ghost lineages with no known ancestors, introgressed sequences from unknown hominins, and inexplicable clusters of shared genetic markers in populations separated by oceans long before recorded navigation. In the Andaman Islands, indigenous tribes carry genetic signatures so ancient and isolated that they seem to belong to a chapter of humanity, written and erased before our known story began. Meanwhile, in parts of the Amazon, geneticists were stunned to discover markers that link isolated tribes to Australasian populations, a connection that should be geographically impossible without deep-time maritime travel or an older global dispersion forgotten by history. The mainstream explanation framed it as an unexpected migration event, a placeholder term for mysteries that cannot yet be incorporated without rewriting the entire timeline. But these ghost lineages suggest something else. Survivors. Remnants of peoples who lived through an age long before the earliest civilizations traditionally recognized. If the first empire did exist, Perhaps only fragments of its people survived the catastrophe that ended it. Their genetic echoes linger like faint footprints after rain, just enough to suggest direction, but not enough to reconstruct the entire path. And yet, when placed alongside the archaeological anomalies, megaliths, alignments, submerged cities, the genetic picture begins to synchronize with the physical one. A global civilization, or proto-civilization, scattered after a collapse so total that the world had to start over from fragments. But the most haunting pattern is not in stone, nor in myth, nor in DNA. It lies in silence, the sudden voids in the archaeological record where something should be, but isn't. Around 10,000 years ago, human cultures everywhere experienced abrupt transformation. Hunter-gatherer societies shifted to sedentary life almost simultaneously across continents. Tools evolved rapidly, symbolic systems proliferated, agriculture appeared in multiple distant regions within a few millennia. Mainstream history calls this the Neolithic Revolution, a sudden flourishing driven by climate shifts and human ingenuity. But the pace is unsettlingly uniform. It is as if humanity received a whisper, a memory, or a push. The mainstream explanation maintains that this was simply convergence, that similar pressures yielded similar responses. But when the answers appear, in places that should have had no contact, often with similar sequences of development, the coincidence strains. Why does monumental architecture arise first in places supposedly lacking agriculture? Why do symbolic systems appear fully formed in cultures with no long developmental arc? Why do star maps emerge everywhere simultaneously, as if humanity suddenly remembered the sky? Researchers who entertain forbidden questions sometimes describe this phenomenon not as invention, but as recollection. Perhaps the first empire left behind knowledge caches, not libraries or devices, but encoded memories, astronomical lore, engineering principles, myths, and alignments that could be passed down orally across generations until rediscovered in new forms by new peoples. If a civilization knew it was dying, knew that a cataclysm was coming, perhaps it scattered seeds across the world. And perhaps thousands of years later, those seeds sprouted simultaneously, creating the illusion of rapid invention. This raises a deeper question. What if the first empire was not defined by monuments or cities, but by knowledge? A knowledge system global in scope, encoded in stars, encoded in ritual, encoded in migration paths and agricultural timing, encoded in mythic archetypes that outlasted the languages that carried them. If so, the physical ruins we find may be only peripheral, the shadows of a culture whose true achievements were carried in the minds and stories of its descendants. But fragments of its physical presence do survive, and one fragment in particular defies all attempts at explanation: the megalithic precision of Puma Punku. High on the Bolivian altiplano, where the wind carries thin air and the horizon stretches unbroken in every direction, lies a site that feels like an industrial complex carved by giants. Massive H-blocks fit together with laser-like accuracy, interlocking in patterns resembling prefabricated components. Drill holes are perfectly cylindrical. Edges are sharp. Surfaces are so smooth they seem machined. And yet the site is supposedly pre-Incan, built by a culture with no written language, simple tools, and no concept of metallurgy advanced enough to shape andesite and diorite, some of the hardest stones on Earth. Mainstream view: the builders used stone hammers, sand abrasion, and patience. but demonstrations consistently failed to replicate the precision found on site. And the scale of the blocks, some weighing dozens of tons, raises logistical questions. How were they moved? Why were they shaped with such complexity when simpler forms would suffice? Most importantly, why does Puma Punku appear as if it were once part of a much larger complex, now shattered as if by force? The stones lie scattered, as if an immense shock wave ripped through the site. Some propose an earthquake, others a flood or landslide. But the dispersion pattern of the stones suggests explosive violence, not human warfare, but something far older and far more catastrophic. If the First Empire ended in a cataclysm that fractured continents, Puma Punku may be one of the few places where the physical scars of that event remain visible. Across the ocean, on Easter Island, the Moai statues stand with silent faces and heavy brows, gazing inland as if watching for something that no longer comes. Beneath them, some buried bodies extend deeper than expected, carved with precision and detail rarely shown in popular images. The islanders' origin myths speak of Hotumatua, a founder who arrived from a vanished homeland swallowed by the sea. Echoes of a lost place, a drowned world, a memory of migration from a civilization that fell beneath waves. When these stories are examined alongside those of Atlantis, Kumari Kandam, Lemuria, and other drowned lands described in mythologies across cultures, a pattern emerges. Nearly every civilization claims descent from an older one destroyed by water. Scholars explain this as a universal fear of floods, but universal fear does not generate identical sequences of events, names, symbols, and timelines. The myths read not like allegory, but like recollection, retellings of something humanity actually witnessed, which leads us to the heart of the tension, the gap between mainstream and unaccepted interpretations. Mainstream scholars argue for caution. They emphasize the dangers of connecting distant anomalies into a unified narrative. They insist that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that coincidence, convergent evolution, and natural explanation must always be exhausted before considering deeper connections. Their concerns are valid. History must be built carefully, not through wishful pattern hunting. But the unaccepted view argues something equally compelling. When anomalies appear not randomly, but in clusters across continents, across disciplines, across eras, and across mediums, stone, myth, DNA, geology, it becomes less rational to treat them as isolated coincidences than to consider a shared origin. This view does not claim certainty. It merely proposes that the official model may be too narrow, too linear, too unwilling to entertain possibilities that would require rewriting foundational assumptions. The truth may lie between these perspectives, neither in dismissing anomalies outright to preserve the timeline, nor in leaping to conclusions without caution. Instead, the anomalies may be signaling that our model of the past is incomplete, not wrong, but insufficient. A skeleton missing half its bones. What missing bones might the First Empire provide? To answer that, we return to the central anchor concept guiding this entire narrative. The idea that the First Empire was not a nation, not a kingdom, but a world-spanning knowledge network. Its temples were observatories, its cities were signal stations, its myths were instruction manuals encoded in imagery, its monuments were memory anchors designed to outlive ice, fire, and flood. Its survivors became the ancestors of later civilizations, carrying fragments of its wisdom into the reborn world. If this is true, the First Empire's greatest achievement was not architecture or agriculture or metallurgy. It was continuity, the deliberate preservation of knowledge across cycles of devastation. If a civilization knew the world would repeatedly face cataclysm, the only way to endure would be to build a system capable of transmitting knowledge not through fragile books or devices, but through symbols, landscapes, alignments, and stories robust enough to survive global reset. Perhaps this is why the same star patterns appear everywhere, why the same myths surface in distant lands, why the same ratios appear in megaliths from Turkey to Peru, why civilizations separated by oceans began suddenly, explosively, as if guided by memory rather than invention. The First Empire's legacy was not lost. It was transformed, broken into pieces, scattered, reinterpreted by new cultures who inherited fragments but not context. The question is, what ended them? To explore that, we must look not only at what the old world built, but what it feared. The myths of fire from the sky, serpents of light, suns that fell, nights that lasted years, oceans that rose overnight. These stories are found everywhere, and they whisper of a catastrophe not merely geological, but cosmic. If we follow the trail of destruction backward through time, the black mats of the younger Dryas layer, the nano-diamonds and melt glass found across continents, the sudden extinction of megafauna, the collapse of early cultures, the pieces point toward a sky-born event, perhaps an impact, perhaps a fragmenting comet, perhaps something even stranger, a solar outburst, a geomagnetic disruption, a cosmic alignment that destabilized the climate. Whatever it was, it hit hard enough to erase an entire epoch. If the First Empire foresaw this, it explains their focus on the heavens, their alignments, their warnings carved in stone, their burial of knowledge, their scattering of memory seeds across the world. This is the precipice we now stand upon, the moment before the fall, the moment the First Empire faced the catastrophe that would end them and reset the world. To understand what truly happened, we must walk deeper into the shadow of that ancient disaster and reconstruct it from the fragments the survivors left behind. In that reconstruction lies our climax. The fall of the First Empire did not begin with flames or trembling ground. It began in the sky, not with a sudden flash, but with a slow, eerie change that the people of that vanished world must have sensed long before the catastrophe arrived. Imagine a night when the stars no longer sit where they should, when familiar constellations pulse strangely, when faint streaks appear at the edges of the heavens, thin like scratches on glass. The elders of that ancient age, guardians of a knowledge now lost to us, must have watched with dread as their celestial calendars began to shift. Something was approaching, something they had charted before, something their ancestors had faced and survived. Barely. In myths across the world, this moment is remembered in fragments. In Mesoamerica, it is the time when the sky serpent writhed in agitation. In India, it is when the gods warned of fire descending from the heavens. In the Australian dream time, the sky people whispered of a shifting sun. In Norse memory, Ragnarok begins with ominous signs in the night sky. These stories do not describe a single event, but a pattern, a period of cosmic disturbance that preceded a world-reshaping catastrophe. If the First Empire mastered astronomy deeply enough to anticipate cosmic cycles, then they may have known the danger well in advance. Their observatories, whether circular stone rings, desert alignments, or mountaintop platforms may have been more than ceremonial sites. They may have been instruments, warnings, beacons tracking a celestial threat that returned at intervals far longer than any civilization, save theirs, could comprehend. The disturbance reached its peak in what modern science calls the Younger Dryas boundary, a stratigraphic line found on multiple continents. Within it lie microscopic diamonds, melt glass, exotic minerals fused by intense heat, and soot from massive firestorms. Natural explanations invoke wildfires or volcanism, but the global distribution of these materials suggests something far more dramatic: fragments of a comet or large cosmic body impacting Earth or exploding in the atmosphere. Scholars who support this hypothesis argue that multiple airbursts or impacts could have triggered immense fires, destabilized ice sheets, and forced abrupt climate change. If such an event occurred, the First Empire would have felt its effects immediately. Firestorms sweeping across continents, shockwaves flattening forests, tsunamis racing toward coasts, a blast of heat strong enough to vitrify stone in distant lands. And after the fire came the cold, a sudden plunge in temperature that lasted more than 1,000 years. But the physical violence was only one part of the catastrophe. The psychological trauma would have been unimaginable. People who had spent generations studying the heavens, believing they understood the rhythms of the cosmos, suddenly confronted a sky that had turned hostile. Their calendars failed. Their predictions collapsed. Their world became unmoored from the cycle they depended on. To them, the catastrophe must have felt like the universe itself had cracked. Across the First Empire's territories, chaos must have spread like a second wave. Crops failed. Rivers changed course. Entire regions became uninhabitable. Coastal cities, already vulnerable from rising waters, were swallowed overnight as glacial melt accelerated. Inland settlements, weakened by famine, migrated or fell. Knowledge centers, temples, observatories, repositories of astronomical lore were abandoned or destroyed. The survivors scattered into fragments, retreating to highlands, caves, and enclaves where oral memory would one day become myth. The evidence of this collapse still exists, scattered like bone fragments after a great beast's death. At Göbekli Tepe, construction abruptly stopped. The site was intentionally buried, as if to preserve something. Some researchers argue the burial was ceremonial. Others suggest it was a desperate attempt to seal knowledge away before the world fell apart. In one layer, carvings depict a vulture holding a sphere, interpreted by some as a record of a cosmic impact. Nearby, other symbols resemble falling stars and shattered celestial patterns. To a civilization watching the sky tear open, how else could they encode the fullness of their fear? In North America, mammoths, mastodons, and other megafauna vanished within a geological instant. Clovis culture, once widespread, disappears from the record. In South America, the earliest Andean settlements show signs of abandonment. In Europe, archaeological layers reveal sudden shifts in tool types and the disappearance of older symbolic traditions. The synchronous changes suggest not isolated events, but a planet-wide disruption. Mainstream scholars attribute these shifts to climate fluctuations and human pressure. And while those factors played roles, the abruptness, the sheer simultaneity, hints at something more violent. The unaccepted view holds that a cosmic event triggered cascading failures across ecosystems and cultures alike. Neither perspective can fully explain all evidence alone. But together, they paint a picture of a world teetering under forces far beyond its control. For the First Empire, the catastrophe was not merely physical, but existential. Their identity, their cosmology, their sense of order was built upon the stability of the heavens. Yet that stability had betrayed them. Suddenly, the axis of the world that connected earth and sky, the mythic pillar, the world tree, the cosmic mountain, collapsed from metaphor into crisis. The celestial anchor they once trusted had shifted. In their stories, this became the moment when the gods left, when the world tree shook, when the sky fell. For the survivors, rebuilding was impossible. The infrastructure of their knowledge system, observatories, temples, libraries of star lore, lay in ruins. The intricacy of their mathematics, their calendars, their engineering, all relied on an understanding of a cosmic order that had been violently broken. Without stable skies, without predictable seasons, without functioning agriculture, the First Empire could not endure. Those who lived fled into the wilderness, carrying fragments of their former knowledge carved into memory, ritual, and myth. Imagine one of these survivors, a custodian of astronomical wisdom, leading a small group through a desolate landscape. Ash hangs in the air like a perpetual twilight. Rivers are choked with debris. The sky is obscured by smoke, the stars invisible. The custodian knows the knowledge he carries cannot survive in its original form. So he teaches in symbols. He shapes myths that encode astronomical events in narrative. He draws the paths of stars as animals, gods, and serpents. He turns mathematical ratios into songs. He encodes warnings and metaphors that future generations can pass on without understanding their origin. This is how the memory of the First Empire became the world's oldest stories. The tale of a golden age cut short, the tale of a flood, the tale of fire from the sky, the tale of gods who once walked among humans, bringing knowledge and structure, then withdrawing when the world fell into chaos. These are not random myths. They are memories, incomplete, distorted, carried across thousands of years by people who no longer knew what they were remembering. The rebuilding of the world after the catastrophe was slow, uneven, and fragmented. In some regions, groups regained agriculture within centuries. In others, it took millennia. Monument building resurfaced in pockets, in Anatolia, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Peru, but always incomplete, always echoing an older, lost blueprint. This is why early civilizations appear to start suddenly, as if remembering rather than inventing. They were not beginning anew. They were attempting to recreate, imperfectly, the patterns left behind by the First Empire. As the world warmed again and stability returned, knowledge flourished in these new centers. But the knowledge was not continuous. It was derivative. The Egyptians built pyramids that reflected older celestial alignments. The Sumerians wrote myths of gods descending from the sky. The Mayans charted cycles they did not fully understand. The Vedic texts spoke of ages lost before our own. Everywhere, the same theme. The past was greater. The present, a diminished shadow. And yet, despite these echoes, the memory of the First Empire remained hidden, buried beneath layers of language, symbolism, and time. Later civilizations treated their inherited wisdom as divine revelation rather than remnants of forgotten humans. Priests codified it, scribes mythologized it. Eventually, the true origin of the knowledge, a civilization destroyed in a cosmic catastrophe, faded into allegory. But the stones remembered. The stars remembered. The earth remembered. If we follow these memory trails far enough, they converge again, this time into the question that defines the climax of our journey. What exactly happened on the day the sky broke? To answer that, we must reconstruct the catastrophe not as myth, but as event, not as story, but as history. And the first clue lies in the oldest myths of all, the ones describing fire that fell like rain, nights without dawn, thunder louder than mountains breaking, oceans rising in a single night. These are not metaphors. They are eyewitness accounts passed through the sieve of time, and through them we can begin to glimpse the final hours of the First Empire. On the final day, the sky must have looked wrong. Not stormy, not overcast, wrong. The horizon glowed faintly even before the sun rose, a dull red shimmer that danced like embers suspended in the air. Birds were silent. Animals moved strangely, as if sensing vibrations humans could not hear. The wind carried a brittle dryness, the kind that precedes lightning. But there were no clouds, no thunderheads, only an oppressive stillness, as though the atmosphere itself were holding its breath. In settlements across the world, the elders of the First Empire would have assembled in their observatories, tracking the thing they had dreaded for generations. Their sky charts predicted a celestial return, a cluster of objects moving in resonance, fragments of some ancient cosmic wanderer whose last visit had left scars upon the earth. They knew it was coming. They had attempted to warn their people. They had carved its approach into stone. The falling stars, the vulture carrying a sphere, the serpent of fire across the heavens. But knowledge could not stop what was approaching. At first it appeared as a faint streak of light, barely noticeable, then another, and another. To those watching from mountaintops or vast plains, the streaks multiplied, scattering like sparks from a grinding wheel. These were not meteors in the modern sense, brief and harmless. These were fragments of something enormous scraping into Earth's atmosphere, igniting trails of plasma that stretched like burning rivers across the sky. The air hummed with static. Ground tremors rippled through ancient stone structures. Dust rose from the earth as if shaken by an invisible hand. Then came the sound. It arrived several moments after the brightest streaks, a deep, rolling thunder that did not come from clouds but from the heavens themselves. A resonance that vibrated in bones. Witnesses would have fallen to their knees, covering their ears as a shockwave moved across continents. This was the moment remembered in myth as the roar of gods, the scream of sky serpents, the shattering of the world tree. The First Empire had prepared for many outcomes, but nothing could prepare them for the violence that followed. A blinding flash erupted above the northern ice sheets. For a fraction of a second, night became day. Then the atmosphere ignited. The airburst was unimaginable, a detonation equivalent to thousands of modern nuclear explosions, compressing air, melting ice, and sending shockwaves racing across the planet. The explosion did not occur on land, but in the sky, magnifying its destructive reach. Entire regions hundreds of kilometers away were scorched instantly. Ice melted into superheated water. Clouds of steam rose in colossal plumes, darkening the sky. The initial blast was only the beginning. As the fragments continued striking the atmosphere, more explosions followed, staggered but devastating. Firestorms ignited forests across continents. Winds stronger than any hurricane tore through valleys. Megafauna were obliterated in seconds. The oceans surged, pushed outward by the force of the blast before rushing back in towering waves. Somewhere in the heart of the First Empire, perhaps in a great coastal city now lost beneath the sea, people would have seen the horizon bulge unnaturally. The ocean rising before it moved, a wall of water taller than any structure they had ever built, advancing silently at first, then with a roar that drowned the earth. The flood myths of Sumer, the tales of Manu, Deucalion, and Hotu Matua all speak of a wave that erased worlds. This wave was not metaphor. It was memory. The sky darkened as debris from the explosions mixed with steam from the melted ice sheets, creating a global shroud that blocked sunlight. Temperatures plummeted within weeks. Plants died. Animals starved. Surviving humans retreated into caves, forests, and highlands, watching as the world transformed into a cold, light-starved wasteland. The First Empire was gone. But the end was not instantaneous everywhere. Some outposts held on longer than others. In high-altitude settlements, remnants of the empire may have kept fires burning, preserving fragments of their knowledge. In desert regions spared from direct impacts, communities might have survived for generations, slowly watching their traditions dissolve as famine forced them to abandon their cities. Small enclaves of astronomer priests possibly held onto their star maps, waiting for the sky to clear, hoping to rebuild the cosmological systems that defined their world. But the darkness lasted too long. Generations later, the grandchildren of survivors no longer understood the symbols their ancestors carved. The rituals designed to preserve knowledge became ceremonies without meaning. The stories explaining the catastrophe turned into myths of angry gods, cosmic battles, or punishments for human pride. What had once been empirical astronomy became legend. What had once been accurate planetary tracking became divination. What had once been a global knowledge network became scattered fragments woven into the religions, calendars, and architectural projects of reborn civilizations. And yet, there were those who attempted the impossible, those who tried to rebuild what the First Empire had lost. Their efforts are visible in the earliest monumental sites of the reborn world. At Göbekli Tepe, builders reconstructed celestial alignments, though without the full mathematical precision of their ancestors. In Egypt, architectural motifs echoed older star maps, but with reinterpretations. In Sumer, myths preserved fragments of ancient cosmology, but recast them into stories of gods and kings. In Peru, the earliest Andean cultures built structures whose alignments mirrored constellations, visible during the catastrophe. These attempts represent humanity reaching toward a memory too fractured to grasp completely. The survivors of the First Empire did not forget everything. They forgot context. They remembered shapes, patterns, alignments, and cycles. They remembered that the sky was important. They remembered that the world had once been destroyed. But they did not remember why. So they told stories. Beautiful stories, terrifying stories, stories that carried the weight of generations who feared the return of the sky serpent, the fire rain, the flood. The climax of this forgotten age is not merely the destruction, it is the revelation embedded within it. Humanity's oldest fear is not of gods, but of memory. Somewhere deep in our collective psyche, we carry the echo of a time when the sky betrayed us. This is why flood myths persist. This is why apocalypse stories echo across cultures. This is why ancient people rebuilt observatories again and again, in Chaco Canyon, in Nabta Playa, in Easter Island, as if compelled by instinct to watch the sky. The tragedy of the First Empire is not only that it fell, but that its knowledge did not survive intact. The catastrophe was so extreme, the darkness so prolonged, the dispersal so chaotic, that no single lineage retained the full memory. Instead, the knowledge splintered, some going into myth, some into architecture, some into calendars, some into star lore, and some into rituals whose meanings were forgotten, but whose forms persisted. This is the legacy of the world that was erased. A mosaic with missing pieces, a puzzle we are only now beginning to reconstruct. But the emotional climax of this story lies not in the destruction, but in the haunting realization that everything humanity built afterward, Sumer, Egypt, Maya, Indus, Shang, may have been attempts to resurrect a memory too ancient to recall consciously. Early civilizations rose with astonishing speed because they were not starting from nothing. They were rebuilding from fragments of a vanished world written into the subconscious of our species. And perhaps the most chilling question of all is the one that follows naturally. If the First Empire fell to a cosmic cycle, could that cycle return? Many of the earliest civilizations rebuilt not only their monuments, but also their cosmologies, with a fixation on long-term celestial cycles, precession, planetary conjunctions, repeating catastrophes. Why? Because their distant ancestors had experienced a cycle that destroyed everything. They inherited the fear even when they no longer remembered its origin. This fear is encoded in myths of world ages, cycles of destruction and renewal, eras that end in fire or flood. It is encoded in the Mayan long count, in the Hindu yugas, in the Greek ages of man, in the Hopi prophecies, in the Norse Ragnarok. These are not independent inventions. They are inherited fragments. The climax brings us to a realization that sits quietly in the shadows of archaeology. Humanity has lived through at least one global reset. And if one occurred, could there have been more? Could the First Empire itself have been a revival of something older still? Such questions do not demand certainty. They simply widen the doorway into the past, inviting us to step through. In the aftermath of the catastrophe, as the world slowly thawed and forests returned, small groups of humans emerged from refuges and began wandering again. They carried stories of the sky fire, of the drowned lands, of the great cities swallowed by the sea. Those who settled became the seeds of the first known civilizations. Those who wandered carried the memory to lands far beyond the reach of the old empire. And in time, as generations passed, the memory dulled but never disappeared. Humanity forgot the First Empire, but we did not forget the fear, and we did not forget the stars. When the world finally warmed again and the sun returned in full, the survivors of the First Empire emerged into a landscape unrecognizable to their ancestors. Vast swaths of coastline had vanished beneath new seas. Forests that once stretched to the horizon were replaced by barren plains. Species that had been part of daily life were gone forever. But perhaps most disorienting of all was the sky. The constellations had shifted. The pole star had changed. Familiar cycles no longer aligned with the calendars of the old world. For a people whose entire cosmology had depended on celestial stability, this was not just a changed world, it was a broken one. The First Empire, or what remained of it, now existed only in scattered communities, each carrying fragments of memory shaped by trauma. Some groups clung fiercely to rituals that once encoded astronomical data, performing them without understanding their deeper purpose. Others abandoned the old ways completely, turning instead to new myths built from loss, survival, and fear. Across continents, knowledge fractured into pieces, and each piece became the seed of a future culture. In the highlands of what is now Peru, descendants of the old empire built early observatories overlooking valleys carved by newly melted glaciers. They watched the stars with reverence and apprehension, searching for signs of the return of the sky fire. Their temples were aligned with solstices and equinoxes, echoes of an older mathematical system whose full complexity was lost, but whose emotional necessity remained. They built platforms of stone not to recreate past grandeur, but to restore a sense of cosmic order in a world that had felt chaotic for generations. Across the ocean in the Near East, small groups settled along the Tigris and Euphrates, carrying oral histories of a great flood that destroyed a golden age. Their stories spoke of beings who taught agriculture and city building after the catastrophe, figures remembered later as Anunnaki, gods, or sages. These beings may not have been divine. They may have been the last astronomer priests of the First Empire, wandering refugees who attempted to salvage scraps of their lost knowledge in the only way left to them, by teaching new societies rising from the ashes. On the plains of Anatolia, the people who buried Göbekli Tepe may have carried on long after the darkness faded. Their descendants might have rebuilt settlements nearby, reduced in complexity and scope, their monumental architecture replaced by practical shelters. The memory of the buried sanctuary remained, but its meaning faded. What had once been an astronomical archive became a mythic place of ancestors. Its pillars became symbols not of star cycles, but of spirits and gods. The cosmic became spiritual. The scientific became ritual. In Asia, early cultures along the Yellow River developed myths of dragon kings who tamed the floods and brought order after chaos. These myths may stem from memories of attempts to stabilize regions devastated by climate change. In India, the Vedic tradition preserved stories of world ages, cycles of destruction and rebirth that strikingly resemble the cosmic catastrophe that ended the First Empire. The idea of a previous golden age destroyed by fire and water is older than their scriptures, older even than agriculture. Among the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, oral traditions tens of thousands of years old describe rising seas swallowing sacred lands, memories of coastlines lost at the end of the Ice Age. Their star lore, some of the most ancient on Earth, preserved constellations that no longer match the current sky, as though their ancestors observed the heavens before axial precession altered the night. Each fragment by itself is intriguing, but together they reveal the same pattern. A shattered memory of a world before ours, refracted through the lenses of cultures trying to rebuild their identity after a planetary trauma. As the centuries turned into millennia, these fragments hardened into cultural foundations. The new civilizations that arose, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, the Andes, began to develop writing, art, architecture, and astronomy. But there is a haunting quality to their earliest works. It is as if they were not creating but retrieving. Their first monuments were often the most precise. Their earliest myths the most cosmic. Their first calendars the most ambitious. This backwards fading is one of the strangest patterns in world history. Instead of gradually improving, many early civilizations appear to begin near their peak and decline or simplify over time before stabilizing into historical patterns. It is as though the first few centuries of each civilization still carried echoes of something older, something remembered dimly, before innovation became grounded in the realities of their own age. The Egyptians, for example, built their most precise pyramids during their earliest dynasties. Later pyramids grew smaller, weaker, and less mathematically perfect. The Sumerians traced their kings to antediluvian rulers who reigned for thousands of years, memories of an older world distorted by time. In the Andes, the earliest megalithic structures display the finest stonework, with later cultures unable to replicate the same precision. Why do the beginnings feel like endings? Why do so many ancient cultures insist that their knowledge was inherited, not invented? Mainstream views explain this as cultural memory, a tendency for societies to mythologize their origins. But mythologizing does not produce mathematically consistent alignments, shared cosmologies, or architectural techniques that appear fully formed. Unaccepted views argue that these civilizations inherited fragments of a far older knowledge system. Neither perspective alone solves the mystery, but in the interplay between them lies a deeper truth. Humanity's rise was not linear. It was recursive. Civilization advanced, collapsed, and advanced again, each time carrying echoes of its previous cycle. The reborn civilizations also inherited an emotional legacy, an ancient anxiety encoded in stories of cosmic destruction. Flood myths, apocalypse cycles, world ages, sky battles. These are not the fantasies of uninformed people. They are the cultural scar tissue of a species that lived through genuine cataclysm. This brings us to the question that every ancient cosmology seems to circle quietly, indirectly, without daring to address directly. Could the event that ended the First Empire be part of a cycle? Celestial cycles are not myths. They are real. The Earth passes through streams of cometary debris at predictable intervals. The solar system moves through dense regions of the galaxy. The tilt of Earth's axis shifts. The sun undergoes cycles of magnetic upheaval. All these processes can produce dramatic environmental changes. What if the First Empire knew this? What if their astronomical system was designed not to worship the heavens, but to monitor them? Imagine a civilization that had survived prior catastrophes, or inherited knowledge from an even earlier age. They would have built observatories aligned with long-term cycles, not seasonal ones. They would have recorded precession, tracked comet paths, and monitored solar behavior. Their myths would encode warnings disguised as stories. Their monuments would point to positions of the sky significant not in their era, but in eras past or future. And if they foresaw another cycle approaching, they might have done everything possible to preserve knowledge. They might have created redundancies, stone architecture, geometric alignments, oral myths, star maps carved in symbolism, so that even if their world fell, some knowledge would endure. We see these redundancies everywhere. The Great Pyramid encodes astronomical ratios. The Mayan calendar tracks cycles far longer than any agricultural society would need. Stonehenge's alignments work across millennia. Nabta Playa, an African megalithic site predating Egypt, aligns with long-term star cycles. The Mithraic star cult of the Roman era preserves zodiacal codes that trace back into deep time. These are not isolated inventions. They are fingerprints. But fingerprints of what? If the First Empire truly understood a cosmic cycle that could bring destruction, then their legacy is not merely architectural or mythological. It is existential. They left behind not just warnings, but reminders. Watch the sky. Learn its rhythms. Do not forget the past. Do not assume the present is stable. Humanity today has technology undreamed of by ancient cultures, yet our memories are short. We understand geology in thousands of years, not tens of thousands. We study myths as literature, not records. We look at ancient cosmologies as metaphor, not data. We live in a time when the stars feel distant, symbolic, decorative, not vital. But for the First Empire, the sky was everything. It was their clock, their calendar, their warning system, their teacher. And if their final message survived in fragments across world mythologies, it may be this: what has happened before can happen again. But this script is not a call to fear. It is a call to wonder, to approach the past not as a closed book, but as a partially burned manuscript, with pages missing and others yet to be rediscovered. It is a reminder that humanity is older, more resilient, and more mysterious than we often allow ourselves to imagine. The story of the First Empire doesn't end with its destruction. It ends with us, the inheritors of its fragments, the last link in a chain stretching back into forgotten ages. Because in the quietest moments, when we look up at the night sky with no lights around us, when the constellations shimmer as they must have for our distant ancestors, we feel something indescribable, a tug of memory, a sense of familiarity in patterns we never learned consciously, as if some part of humanity remembers the old world, the world before the sky fell. As if some echo of the First Empire still whispers in the background of our thoughts, urging us to look up, to remember, to wonder. And this brings us gently toward the closing of this journey, a return to the quiet questions that linger when all the stones, myths, and ruins have been examined. The questions that cannot be answered definitively, but must be carried like lanterns through the darkness of unrecorded time. Long after the fall of the First Empire, long after the reborn civilizations had written their own histories atop the ashes of forgotten ages, humanity began to forget that it had forgotten. The ancient trauma softened into myth. The myth crystallized into religion, the religion faded into legend, and the legend dissolved into symbols etched onto pottery, into star maps whose meanings were lost, into stones arranged by hands that remembered the shapes, but not the purpose. In time, the world became familiar again. Forests grew thick over places where temples once stood. New rivers carved their own paths through plains reshaped by ancient floods. Mountains that had once been observatories became sacred sites for entirely different reasons. The people who lived in these transformed landscapes told stories to explain them. Tales of giants, gods, dragons, titans, floods, fires, and wars. None of them knew they were describing memories older than their language, but traces endured. A fragment of ancient ratio encoded in the layout of an Egyptian temple, a mathematical constant preserved accidentally in Mayan calendars. A star alignment hidden in the foundation of a European henge. A flood myth recorded across 5 continents by cultures who had never met. A memory of fire falling from the sky encoded in chants whispered by elders in the Arctic and in the jungles of equatorial islands. And as millennia passed, those fragments waited. Not for recognition, they had no expectation, but simply for context. For someone, somewhere, In an age not yet imagined, to look upon them not as isolated curiosities, but as parts of a single unified tapestry. Humanity had lost the story, but not the evidence. Now imagine the world today. Imagine a researcher standing at the edge of a desert mound, brushing away dust from a carved symbol whose age stretches beyond any recorded civilization. Imagine a diver descending into the shadowy depths off the coast of India, illuminating stones that have not been touched by sunlight in 12,000 years. Imagine a geneticist staring at a sequence of DNA that appears inexplicably ancient. Imagine an astronomer seeing a pattern in star lore shared by cultures separated by oceans. In each case, the discovery feels isolated, but the whisper beneath them is the same. Something happened here, long before us. Something enormous. Something forgotten. And though modern science approaches these clues with caution, as it should, the mere accumulation of anomalies begins to exert a quiet pressure. Not to abandon reason, but to ask whether reason itself requires a wider frame. Whether the human story is not linear but cyclical, whether the rise of civilization is not a straight ascent but a spiral, with memory rising and falling like breath. If the first empire did exist, its legacy would not be grandeur or dominance. Its true legacy would be fragility. A reminder that even global knowledge systems, even cultures capable of building with stone that survives millennia, can be swept away in a single terrible night. Perhaps this is why early civilizations rebuilt with such intensity, as if racing against time, driven by an inherited instinct that the ground beneath them was not permanent, that the sky above them could turn hostile again. It may also explain why so many ancient cultures placed such reverence on cycles: solar cycles, lunar cycles, planetary cycles, ages of the world. They were not merely tracking time, they were watching for patterns, watching for return. And yet, despite the fear encoded in these traditions, their tone was not only dread. Many early cosmologies hold that with each cycle comes renewal, that the destruction of an age brings the possibility of a new beginning, that every end is a form of remembering. This perspective softens the tragedy of the First Empire. It suggests that their fall was not the extinction of knowledge, but the transformation of it. That what humanity carries today, our inventive mind, our hunger for meaning, our curiosity about the universe, is itself a gift from those who came before. That their survival strategy worked, even if imperfectly. Fragments of their wisdom live on in us, not as literal memory, but as intuition, as pattern recognition, as the strange feeling that our species is older than our history books suggest. And so the narrative turns inward, toward the present moment, toward the listener sitting in a quiet room as this story unfolds. It is late, perhaps late evening, perhaps early morning. The room is dim. The world outside is still. The night sky, if you can see it, stretches quietly overhead, the same sky that watched the rise and fall of forgotten civilizations. As the words settle, you might feel a subtle shift, not a conclusion, but an opening, a widening of imagination. What if the ruins we find are not primitive beginnings, but remnants of a world more ancient than we dared consider? What if humanity has risen more than once? What if you are living inside one of many cycles, each with its own forgotten empires? What if the greatest stories we call myths are simply memories worn smooth by time? The answers are not necessary. The questions themselves are the gift, the gentle unraveling of certainty that allows curiosity to bloom. Perhaps somewhere beneath the soil of a forest, you have walked through lies a stone shaped by hands older than recorded time. Perhaps beneath the surface of a familiar coastline rests the foundation of a city swallowed at the end of the last ice age. Perhaps a story told to you as a child contains a faint echo of an event that once shook the entire world. We will never know the full truth, but maybe we are not meant to. The power of the first empire's forgotten history lies not in certainty, but in possibility. Not in proving that it existed, but in recognizing that our world holds mysteries deeper than we usually allow ourselves to imagine. And so we return to where we began, a forgotten beginning, a lost chapter of humanity's story, a world erased but not entirely gone. Its remnants linger in stone, in myth, in DNA, in the night sky. They linger in us, too, in the quiet sense that our species has known more than it remembers. As this journey comes to an end, let the questions remain with you gently, without urgency. What else might lie beneath the surface of our familiar world? How many civilizations rose and fell before the first lines of recorded history? And if the first empire truly existed, what did they learn, what did they fear, and what did they hope we would remember? Let these thoughts drift softly as the night deepens around you. Let them settle like ancient dust in a forgotten temple. Let them glow quietly, like stars reflected in dark water. Not answers, not conclusions, only wonder. And in that wonder, perhaps, the old world lives again, not as certainty, but as possibility, waiting patiently for the next curious mind to look toward the past and listen.